there is an activist component to this where we're trying to enlarge the community of people who feel that art is for them. And we feel that if that community can be enlarged, if more people feel like fine art is something that is not just for the elite, that would increase art support, in the general population. I've been saying a long time, art needs to make friends.
Hello, and welcome to Art Restart, where we learn from artists who, wherever they work, whatever they make, are shaking up the status quo in their fields and in their communities. I'm Pier Carlo Talenti, the producer and editor of this podcast, a production of the Thomas S. Keenan Institute for the Arts at the University of North Carolina School of the Arts. In this episode, we'll be speaking with Jennifer Dalton and William Powhida, the co-creators of Zero Art Fair. What is Zero Art Fair? Well, Jennifer and Bill will explain that themselves, but a little bit about their artistic practice will give you an important context. They are both visual and conceptual artists who, for the last decade, have collaborated on sharp, often darkly funny critiques of the art world's economic and political machinery, which keeps a lot of new potential art lovers firmly locked out. One of their earliest collaborations was in concert with an artist collective called FIPCA. Together, they produced a satirical telethon during the Great Recession titled Telethon for the 1%, which then led Jen and Bill to ask themselves the question, wait, what if we did an art fair where all the art was free? That question eventually led them to create Zero Art Fair, which launched in 2024 in a beautiful barn in the Hudson Valley as part of Upstate Art Weekend, and then recurred in 2025 at the Flag Art Foundation in Manhattan. In short, very short, Zero Art Fair is a fully functioning art fair that uses a radically different contract, which Bill had been using for a while to sell his own pieces, to redistribute both artworks and power within the art market. The two Zero Art Fairs have managed to place 400 works of contemporary art into the homes of art lovers, most of whom were either new to collecting and/or could not remotely afford to purchase these pieces on the regular art market. How could this happen? Because the art was free with a 5-year store-to-own agreement. I can't wait for you to hear how it all works. I started off our conversation by asking Jen and Bill to walk me through what I, as an art lover of limited means, would have experienced when I arrived at Zero Art Fair.
Well, it depends if it was the first fair or the second fair.
Let's do the second fair, because I'm going to talk to you later about different changes you made between the first two.
Okay. Bill, you want to talk through the second fair at Flag?
Yeah, well, we'll cover this difference later, but for the second fair, not only did you have to know about Zero Art Fair, you had to know that there was a registration period ahead of the fair where you could go on our website, answer a few very simple questions about who you are, give us some contact info, and put yourself in one of kind of three buckets, whether you needed help to live with art, if you could normally afford to live with art, or if you could help others live with art. And based on those responses, we prioritized access for people who said they needed help to live with art.
That's a big change between the two. Because I imagine what happened in the first, since you were on the literal art map, a lot of people who did have means probably showed up first.
We certainly had a few folks who would fit that category, particularly because the Wall Street Journal, surprisingly, wrote a very friendly, kind of preview of what the fair was. So, I think we had one couple that rolled in from Connecticut who claimed they had never really bought art before, but clearly had found out about it from reading the Wall Street Journal. I think they said as much. Yeah, just to continue with that process, once people registered and let us know they were interested in the fair, we kind of used a weighted randomizer to sort of assign tickets and timed entry slots, because we had to balance, how many people could physically come into the space with the available amount of artwork, so there wouldn't be sort of nothing left, in the last hours of the fair. And that definitely presented some challenges we can talk about, but once somebody had a ticket in an assigned time slot and they came up the elevator to the 9th floor of Flag Art Foundation, they could walk in. If they saw work that they were interested in taking home, they could, one, if they had the means, they could buy the artwork outright still, which happened in a few cases, or they could ask to sign the contract and take the work upstairs, have it packed up, and take it home with them that day. So that's the basic process for how people would get work. And, inevitably in that equation, there was always somebody who'd say, so when do I pay? And we're like, you don't, not yet. It's
unless you wanted to buy it outright, like you said.
Unless you want to buy it. Yeah, unless you want to buy it outright, you don't have to put any money down to, take this work home. But if you were to sell the work after a period of 5 years, you would have to pay the artist 50% of that at sale price.
Yeah, and the artist never gives up copyright.
Right.
So and the new friend, the collector, takes immediate physical possession of the work.
I love that in the contract, your collector is called friend.
Yeah. And well, as Amy Whitaker, who helped build with that original contract, has mentioned, the contract just gets less. It started out extremely friendly, but as we've had to, strengthen the language, it's getting a little less friendly, but it still has some friendly aspects. So the person who's holding the work, who's storing, Bill originally called the contract store to own. So they're storing the work for 5 years and ownership is gradually vesting. And then after 5 years, they will, if nothing changes in the interim, there's a couple of caveats, but if nothing changes in the interim after the 5 years, the new owner, the new storer, completely owns the work outright.
But should the new owner sell the work thereafter, the artist gets a portion of proceeds from any future sales. Is that correct?
Yes, 50%.
Yeah, for this would be technically the first sale of the work, right. And the artist would also be granted subsequent resale royalties on future sales of the work. And that, is a 10% resale royalty. Definitely borrows from, European droit de suite and like resale royalties that those artists get to enjoy.
Because here, should either of you sell a work of art to a collector, you have no more rights to that work of art.
No economic or moral rights.
Collector can pretty much do whatever they want.
Yeah. So we asked Alfred Steiner to see if he could graft on some of the language from French moral rights for artists, including the ability to ask a work not be necessarily exhibited in an exhibition that they didn't want their work to be shown.
It seems to me, because I'm an idealist, that this should be par for the course. Is there a movement for this moral rights to happen here in America?
There have been intermittent movements, but I think that gallerists, art dealers, will say it is already hard enough to sell art. Mm-hmm. And that these, resale and moral rights make it even more onerous. So there are intermittent movements, and we would love to be a part of that. Mm-hmm. And that's, seeding the art ecosystem with these 400 or so works that over the past 2 fairs, that is one effort that we're trying to advance. It doesn't seem to gather a lot of steam, at least not so far.
And I want to make sure I understand the vesting system also over those 5 years. It's 20% each year. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that could happen during the vesting period that changes the contract or that changes the trajectory is that an artist, like say you have a work of mine and you've held it for 2 years and I am approached by someone else who'd like to buy it. And for easy math's sake, let's say they want to buy this work they say, is this work available? I would buy this for $1,000. I would go to you. You would get right of first refusal, and you would get a 40% discount off of that price that I'm being offered because you have a 40% interest in the work at this point after 2 years. Yeah.
Right. And then I either get the 40% discount or I say no thanks, and then your $1,000 buyer gets the work.
That's right.
Has that happened yet?
No. No, it hasn't happened. Yeah, and Bill's original bunch of work, 30 something, I think, works that he used the contract to transfer, those have all vested, right? It's been more than 5 years too.
Yeah, all of those works have transferred, and I have not been approached by any collectors interested in buying that work. And no one has, to my knowledge, tried to sell the work, after the period so far.
Right. Because according to the contract, you would have to be notified.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that is one of the, sort of asks and collector responsibilities. We also, tell artists like set up, Google alerts for
Right.
your
Of
name, for
course.
the titles of these works, because, there are many regional auction houses, throughout the United States of where works come up for sale and they don't have the same visibility as, a Sotheby's or Christie's sale.
I can understand how this system benefits a collector of limited means who wants to get into the game or just loves art and would love to have art she loves in her house. How does it benefit participating artists?
There are a few ways. I mean, the first most obvious one that we talk about is that, most artists, especially when they get to a certain age, they're storing a lot of work. Storage is expensive. It also kind of weighs you down. It's also depressing.
Right.
So, it isn't sustainable, as we say over and over again. It really isn't sustainable for artists. It's not like artists can give away all their work, but many of us
No,
are
because
storing, which
if
is
they
wrong.
did in our system, the value of their work would start to diminish, right?
Right.
Okay.
But many artists are storing a lot of work and they could let go of a couple works.
Mm-hmm.
And so in addition to clearing storage, which is one way it benefits artists, I think most artists really are sad to see that their work is not in a loving home and benefit from the connection, a new connection made with a person who would not normally be able to afford it. I mean, I know many of us, it's an awkward, uncomfortable situation for our work to be priced at an amount that people in our class cannot purchase, So to be able to
Right.
make work available to, quote unquote regular people is a really beautiful thing. And then a third thing I would say is that there is an activist component to this where we're trying to enlarge the community of people who feel that art is for them. And we feel
Ah.
that if that community can be enlarged, if more people feel like fine art is something that is not just for the elite, that would increase art support, in the general population. I've been saying a long time, art needs to make friends.
Yeah, I think if you're trying to make an argument that there should be, greater public funding for artists, this is an avenue in which art can get outside of the 1% and, the sort of upper classes to working class people, and right now it's a lot of people who work in the arts, but also can't afford, the thing that they have sort of dedicated their lives to. And that condition, applies to a lot of artists too. A lot of us can't afford the things that we make or the things that our friends make. So, in some ways, artists have long had a system to deal with this where they trade with each other, and often
Uh-huh.
works of sometimes very, incommensurate, economic value. And, I think, we do talk about this with artists that there may not be this kind of direct material benefit from the economic value of the work, but we don't give up on that value. We're not just giving the work away. There's a kind of delay, in the possibility of receiving economic compensation for the value of the work. And so it's still possible. And, we hope that like kind of seeding, the idea that artists could retain equity in their work, that artists deserve or should receive resale royalties, I think is something that benefits artists as a whole or a community. And so that's part of the balance of, an artist might be giving up a small fraction of inventory that they've made that hopefully has been exhibited previously, that has had an opportunity to sell, but maybe didn't find a buyer. That there is this kind of longer term benefit for the whole, rather than just to kind of focus on how does this benefit me directly.
Have you gotten any pushback or resistance from, or any unexpected pushback or reactions from any artists you approach to take part?
I guess I wouldn't say unexpected. I mean, we expected pushback.
What did that look like? The pushback?
Just artists who don't want to give their work away and would prefer to hold on to it in their studios in the hope, of that it would be sold. And, we are just like, great, this idea isn't for everyone. But I would say, I was surprised at how few people that was. Like, we really did get a lot of positive response and people wanting to do it, like a much greater percentage than I would have guessed.
I'd love to hear about some like fun, wonderful surprises or stories you've heard or experienced in the 2.0 art fairs.
One kind of comes immediately to mind. We had a kind of reception for the artists and their new collectors that took place after the fair this fall. It was
That's a great idea. I'm glad you did that. Yeah.
That idea came directly from Glenn Furman, who sort of founded Flag. It's his collection. He thought it would be something really important, to try to build these relationships. So, we can thank Glenn for making that possible and coming up with, that concept. While we were at that reception, one of the artists, Diana Spungen, said that, it turned out that the collector of her work was a curator of the Jack Whitten show, or was the curator, I should say, of the Jack Whitten retrospective at MoMA, and, invited Diana to come to MoMA and gave her like a 3-hour tour of the show, which was sort of wonderful, that, she sort of developed a new relationship with somebody who may be in a position to look at her work or make some connections for her. And, it's one of these tricky things where we might think, a curator at that level must have, enormous wealth or something that they could somehow afford to buy work. But we also know that, many curators are not that well paid.
Right. She would be in the second bucket that you mentioned.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And so I think it was just, Diana was so excited and just pleased with that outcome that I wish everyone could have that kind of same experience with, their collector. But we know it's like a really interesting range of people that came to the fair and were interested in taking the work home. But that one really just jumped out at me, that she had such a kind of great, kind of outcome with placing some very large, difficult to place sculptures and paintings.
Another thing that comes to mind is that, during the first fair that was part of Upstate Art Weekend, so people are running around from, venue to venue to venue, in the Hudson Valley. Somebody came to Zero Art Fair and procured the first work, the first original art they'd ever owned. And then we later found out they went to another gallery and they bought the first work that they'd ever purchased. And I think that, we kept thinking, well, I guess, the first one's free. We're starting cycle of generosity. We are, getting people to see that this is something that is within reach, and yeah, encouraging people to see art that way. And we really do hope that, anybody who can buy art does, and perhaps seeding them with an easy entry point can help spur that.
I wonder if you can, because we touched on this, if either of you can remember a time or the time when you realized, oh, I couldn't actually afford a work of my own art.
Oh, I feel like artists talk about that all the time.
Yeah.
And it creates this strange feeling to have, a dollar value placed on your work out in the world that puts it out of reach of everyone, and then and then that means that
It's also a mark of great success. It's a double-edged sword, I guess.
I just had a very specific experience with that very question. Speaking of regional auctions, a collector of mine apparently had passed away, and the entire collection was sort of put up for sale, kind of Midwestern auction house. I saw that it was valued at like the opening bid on a no reserve auction was something like $200 for a piece that I believe sold for $5,000. And, on social media, I was like, oh boy, I think I'm going to have to try to buy this one back because I might be able to afford it. Not that spending anything over like $500 would put a significant dent in our like monthly budget.
Right.
That would be the ceiling. And, a few people responded, on like Blue Sky that they would be interested. A couple of friends let me know that they were trying to kind of like maybe acquire the work for 1,000 or, and I mean, ultimately it sold for, I think, around $2,000, which is less than half of its retail value, but it does show that my work does retain some value. But it was, it was sort of it's a painful, kind of embarrassing, sort of thing to happen. And knowing that, I certainly didn't have the means to kind of like reinvest, into my work or something.
And it's also, in a way, it must be, it's public. I mean, there must be talk out in the world about so-and-so's work sold for this amount.
Oh, totally.
Right.
Right. And I mean, that's one of the reasons that galleries dislike auction sales in general, is it's public and it's not controllable.
Yeah. And I think when Jen mentioned that, retail prices are something of a kind of, phantasm or something, there is this sense that it's not just a myth. Myth is almost too neutral. There is something, it's like a specter, you're almost haunted by these, prices. Right. Because if works aren't selling for their estimates or above their estimates, it's like this work is broken, or it doesn't have the value that it claims. But, so few works actually make it to auction. There's a kind of institutional bias already that, the main auction houses are taking works that they know they can sell, that they have an audience. Obviously, there's some risk and they can't predict the whole thing, but it's very choreographed, to kind of give the appearance that art is, this kind of stable, lucrative investment vehicle, which is just not the experience that most of us have, whether it's selling work in the primary market, achieving very, very high prices for the work, or having a sort of second life in the secondary auction market, and becoming a kind of commodity.
Right. And the other thing about prices being some sort of, I don't know, propagandistic phantasm or something is that they never go down. So they never publicly go down. So, if I have a show where my 20 artworks are priced at $10,000 and none of them sell, at my next show in a few years, they will be priced at $15,000. And that's like, what kind of so-called market is that?
Right.
And because, you can't ever upset people who bought your work for the lower price for the higher price by lowering your prices. But then it just means that, your prices get further and further from reality.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's based on this notion that there's a kind of fairness standard, in retail that somehow, like the art market doesn't operate like a lot of other familiar markets. The pricing system is sort of monodirectional upward. But this idea of fairness is sort of like, the question is, who is it fair to? Is it only fair to people with the means that can buy the artwork, or could we think about fairness sort of progressively, and think about price as being something that's flexible for different audiences, different demographics, within our kind of market-based consumer society. But it's a question that I think is still one of those kind of, very touchy or sort of sore points around, this idea of kind of fairness.
Yeah.
Yeah, in the art market.
Do you remember, this is a bit of out of field question, but do each of you remember the first work of art that you love that you were able to afford?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. For me, my wife and I were visiting Schroeder Romero Gallery, which was a gallery I ended up actually showing with a few years later. But we were at a group show they had curated, and there was a small painting, part of a group of small works by this artist, Jack Chartier, who is from Seattle. And I had just sort of become aware of their work. So I was participating in a group show in Seattle. And, it was like a $400 painting. And my wife and I, made a payment schedule with the gallery to kind of pay it off over the period of like 4 or 5 months. But that was the first work that like we both agreed upon that we would, purchase, for our tiny apartment in Williamsburg at that point.
Well, you just taught me something. I didn't know that you could make payment arrangements with some galleries.
It's possible.
Yeah.
Okay. What about you, Jen? The first painting, the first work of art that you were able to afford and love?
What's funny is I still have this work hanging next to my bed in my bedroom, and I'm not able to remember the artist's name right now. And so that is terrible. But it was so like in the 90s, I bought a piece at a small gallery in LA called Miller Durazo. And I remember that they were these little drawings and they were priced at, I think they were priced at like $200 unframed and $300 framed. And some of them were unframed and some were framed. And what I wanted is I wanted one of the framed ones, but I couldn't afford to have it framed. And so I was like, can I get this one, but can I have it unframed? And I was such a novice. I didn't know that like you can't just like pop the thing out of the frame because the frames aren't like from Target. And so I was really, really stuck when they said, you can have that work, but actually you're going to have to take it framed. Like, we're not taking this out of the frame. And so I had to go home and think about it.
For the extra $100.
Yes, the extra $100. And I came back and I did it.
Wow. Given the work that you've done about critiquing the so-called art world, and has any part of Zero Art Fair felt like a work of art?
I mean, I don't think either one of us, we've talked about this. We don't see it as a work of art, but it really it's a lot of the same creative and like sort of satisfying problem solving efforts, and like we both have, kind of conceptual practices. And I think it just feels like, it does feel sometimes like a big collaborative art project, even though I think neither one of us would call it like our artwork.
Yeah, I don't think it helps the fair to, kind of claim it as a work, even a collaborative work. And
yeah, it makes it a little more elite in a certain way.
And not
And
just
it makes it about us.
Right.
Yeah, it doesn't. We don't have to center ourselves in this project. There is a hope, that this project is a model, that it's a template that, other people with the right funding, interest in communicating with us could run this fair elsewhere, that it's, a little more open source than kind of traditional art project where, the side effect of a lot of art projects is it generates a lot of value, for the artist in their career. And that's not something we've been, so interested in kind of pursuing. And, the fair also had to be functional, and it's like, a lot of people think about art as what makes it unique is that it doesn't necessarily have to serve any particular function. It's sort of autonomous. And, by keeping it art adjacent, it allows us to sort of think differently, to actually think kind of pragmatically, like, how does this work? No, it's not. We don't want this to be ambiguous. We actually need to have like a very clear process and method for making things happen. So yeah, I totally agree with Jen. It uses a lot of art thinking, it uses a lot of the same skills, and it, pushes our ideas into a different sort of like part of the art world. And it really engages, production and distribution of art, at conceptual levels. Yeah, no, not like an artwork by Jen and Bill,
So let's say somebody because there's amazing artists working all over the country in big and small towns. If somebody wanted to replicate this model in their community, what would be your first words of advice to them?
Well, we have this question that we ask ourselves that, comes from Manon Sloan, but it's, who pays for free? And the sort of first piece of advice would probably have to do with how they're going to pay themselves, how they're going to essentially pay the artist, an honorarium if there's an exhibition component. And
so your participating artists get an honorarium, regardless.
We were able to have that funded the second fair.
So it sounds like that's one of your first lessons to somebody else who wants to replicate it, is that there is startup cost.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, and the venue, and really it's quite a lot of time. Like, it's quite a lot of admin.
But, I think what we hope too is that by creating, this kind of template, that if we're able to really take what we've done internally, put together almost a kind of handbook for how you could do this, if another community or another institution sees the benefit of being able to, tap a little bit of this kind of vast inventory of work sitting, nationally in storage spaces and studios, under people's living rooms, or, in barns all over the country, that would be a public good, and that maybe it is worth, putting a few $1,000s or, up to $50,000 together to get, in our case, up to like $500,000 of retail artwork out into homes,
Wow.
and I think that is a really interesting value proposition. Whether or not those retail prices are real, the work has this other set of values: aesthetic, conceptual, spiritual. I mean, your question about, the first artwork that we're able to sort of buy or live with, that's something we want other people to be able to experience. That kind of interesting thing that happens when you have a unique object in your home over a long period of time that, in some cases, maybe a child grows up with and sees that art is something that's in their home that's accessible to them. That was a kind of motivating thing, I think. I heard from another artist not too long ago about even a reason to make physical objects after having a kind of, digital or sort of less material practice, that their work could live in a home, and be experienced outside of kind of institutional, sort of settings.
Yeah, and I would add, one of the core, tenets of Zero Art Fair is that price doesn't equal value. So decoupling those two ideas and getting people, and even if the people get the work for free and they have it in their home, and I think that, that really, they can really feel viscerally, emotionally, spiritually, the value of having that work, and it has nothing to do with how much they paid for it.
Are you already planning fair number 3?
We're figuring it out. We've been taking 1 year at a time.
Good for you.
But yeah, we're figuring it out. I don't think we're done, though.
If you'd like to learn more about Jen and Bill and read a longer version of this interview, just head to uncsa.edu/artrestart. Hey, do me a favor. Would you please do all those things that help us out? Subscribe or follow, rate and review us, all of that good stuff. We'd love that. And if you know and love an artist shaking up the status quo that you'd love us to profile, let me know. Or if there's a subject you'd like us to do a deep dive on, like why does US law not have the so-called moral rights that protect artists in France, for instance, you can find me on Instagram at PierCarloTalenti. Our theme music is by Shanghai Restoration Project. I'm Piercarlo Talenti, and on behalf of the Keenan Institute for the Arts, thank you for listening.